Hi, my name's Jody Bishop. Welcome to our program. This will be the first time I actually introduce the program, and our brother Scott's going to introduce our speaker. But we've got a really special speaker, and we want you to remember to subscribe to our channel. Go down and subscribe to our channel, like our channel, and also share the channel with your friends, especially your Muslim friends, especially people that love the Lord Jesus Christ. And here to introduce our speaker is Scott Walton.
Thanks, Jody. Tonight we have a very special guest, and it's one of my professors from seminary, which is why I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Daniel Janosik. Dr. Janosik is adjunct professor of apologetics, historical theology, and Islamic studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I'm attending, and he's also been producing classes for Veritas Seminary. He teaches on Islam. So tonight he's going to talk to us about the latest developments in Islam. So give it up for Doctor and our brother in Christ, Daniel Janosik.
Okay, good evening, you all. I'm Daniel Janosik, and as Scott mentioned, I am looking forward to this time, and I want to kind of update you on some of the things that are happening in the Muslim world. I work at several places. I teach at a number of places. One is at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where Scott has been my student, and he's a good student, good questions, good intellect. And I also teach at Veritas Seminary now, where I have linked up with Dr. J. Smith and others such as Al-Fadi and Dan Brubaker and some other good colleagues. And we have put together a master's degree program there. At Southern Evangelical, we have a certificate program, and we feed into the Masters of Apologetics there. So both places are excellent. They're sister schools. Dr. Norman Geisler founded them both. And so it's my privilege to be with you all. And I want to give you kind of an update of where we are in reaching out to the Muslim world and where they are in looking at the historical critique. One thing that Dr. Smith and I do in a lot of our classes is to deal with what is called the historical critique. And that means that we go back to especially the 7th and 8th centuries of Islam, of the Middle East, and we put together the newest information that's come out. Not the stories that were written 200 years later. We're not talking about a Muhammad or a Mecca that's written about in the 9th and 10th centuries, but we're trying to get to the core of the truth. That which was not written down by Muslims, and but was recorded in a number of different things. So we're going to be looking at that, and I am going to bring up a PowerPoint to lead us through, and so I will be sharing my screen with you. The first slide, latest developments in Islam, and there is my email at SES if you want to contact me later, and I also have a website where I put up a lot of material, and that's the danieljanosik.com. Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at some of these latest developments, because when you look at the forensic science, the archaeology, the first-hand written documents from the 7th and 8th centuries, not the 9th and 10th centuries, you find that there is a very different story of the first 100 years of Islam. And that's what we're going to look at. The traditional Islamic view states that an Arab named Muhammad received revelations from Allah through the angel Gabriel in a city called Mecca. And within 20 years after Muhammad's death, these revelations were written down in a book called the Qur'an. We want to see if that is true. That's what's been given for 1400 years. That's what all Muslims believe, or most of them. But we want to go back and look at the historical information that is being dug up as we speak. A lot of this is new information, and it's exciting information because Muslims need to know this too, especially Muslims. However, as I said, this information is turning the whole traditional view upside down. We are learning, for example, that the Muhammad of traditional Islam was probably an invention of a later Arab leader. That is a revelation for a lot of people. We're finding out that the Quran was probably not collected and written down until the early 8th century from many sources, including Christian and Jewish liturgy. Can you imagine that? Christian liturgy, Christian sources being put in the Quran. Why? If the Quran was an eternal book written long before all these other books, why would these Christian stories and Jewish stories, and many of them, not stories from the Bible, but just stories from traditional sources and what we would call apocryphal sources as well. And thirdly, that the city of Petra in northern Arabia was likely the birthplace of Islam instead of Mecca, which was probably not established as a city until much later, much after the death of Muhammad. As we will see, probably not until the 8th century. So who was Muhammad if Mecca did not exist in the time that he was supposed to live? That's a big question that we need to deal with. So we're looking at the man, the book, and the place. 3 phrases that Dr. J. Smith likes to bring up: the man, the book, and the place. Muhammad, the Quran, and Mecca. Did they exist in the time that they were supposed to exist? What do we know about them? Robert Spencer, in his book, Did Muhammad Exist?, wrote this particular line: the more one looks at the origins of Islam, the less one sees. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, of course, you dig further, you go back into the earliest sources, you look at the rock inscriptions, you look at the coins, you look at the non-Muslim writings from that time, because you don't have Muslims writing in the 7th century about Muhammad or any of this. But you do have some non-Muslims. We're going to look at what they said to get a better picture. So first, we'll look at the traditional claims of the Muslims. They believe that the life of Muhammad was lived out in the full light of history. They like this phrase by a writer named Renan. And was it really in the full light of history? Do we know all the historical sources? Were the people who wrote about Muhammad, did they live in the time of Muhammad? Did they get the word directly from Muhammad? We'll find out that the answer to that is no, they were not there. The earliest that the Muslims wrote about Muhammad was 150 to 200 years after his death. Muslims believe that Muhammad was already a revered prophet and a model of moral conduct for his followers as he lived in the middle of the 7th century. Remember, his life was supposed to span 570 AD to 632. And so Muslims believe that his followers wrote about him, and those writings remain existent today according to the traditional view, but we don't have them. We can't find them. And so did they ever exist? Thirdly, the Quran as a revealed book was written down in Arabic within 20 years of Muhammad's death. That's what they believe. That during the time of Uthman, they had the final copy, and then that was sent out, and that's the same book, the same Quran that is used today, word for word, letter for letter. They believe that nothing has been changed from the time of Uthman in that particular Quran. They also believe that Islam as a religion was fully formed by the time Muhammad died in 632, fully formed, everything in place. And we know that that's not true, because even in their own sources, in their own stories, there was still much to be developed. And then fifthly, the Arabs were pagans before Muhammad came to convert them to Islam. So all of Saudi Arabia was in a state of Jahiliyyah. which is ignorance. They didn't know anything about God, and Muhammad came and taught them the truth, and they turned to Islam because of that. But we'll see that even that does not hold to be true. So anyway, these are the traditional accounts. This is my remit. I need to show whether these are accurate or not. My remit is that they are not. We'll see what the history and the archaeology and the coins and other things say about this particular information. We want to see how accurate this traditional view is. So whenever you see this picture of a mosque, a beautiful mosque, it will be a claim by Muslims. And then I will show you a different background for what the critique would be. So here we have the first claim dealing with Muhammad. Muslims believe that Muhammad lived in Arabia between 570 and 632 AD. He left the city of Mecca in 622 and settled in Medina until his death in 632. So this would be the timeline. Born in Mecca at 570. When he was 25, he married Khadijah, who was 40 at that time. She was a businesswoman. And when he was 40, he had his first vision, and that was in 610, a vision, a revelation from the angel Jibril or Gabriel. And then in 622, after his wife died, he left Mecca, and he escaped from Mecca to Medina, and that's where he set up his political headquarters. And in just 8 years after that, 630, he came back and conquered Mecca, and then 2 years later, he was dead at the age of 62. So that's what most Muslims would know about Muhammad. That's all we know from their traditional background until you come to the what are called the hadith. These were the stories of Muhammad, what he did, what he said, and there are thousands of them. But when were they written, and who wrote them, and how were they transmitted? They were not written down at the time of Muhammad. In fact, most of them were not written down until 200 years later. And that's a long time, especially if they're relying on oral communication and the memorization. Of course, people can memorize things and pass it on. But first, you have to have knowledge that it was something that actually happened. And many of these hadiths, even by Muslims, are recognized to be fraudulent. In fact, Bukhari, one of the early collectors of the hadith, is said to have collected well over 200,000 of these, but he whittled it down to only about 7,000. So that's a very small percentage that he would whittle it down and say, okay, these that I have, these are genuine, these are accurate, these are what they call sahih, and those other ones are not correct, or they're fraudulent. And even then, they recognize that many of those stories were fraudulent. Well, perhaps all of them are fraudulent. That's what we have to determine as we work through the historical critique. Okay, what about Muhammad's life, his birth, anything that we know about him? Of course, there weren't any birth records. They didn't have that at that time. But we should have something to signify that a man named Muhammad lived at that time. But we don't, at least from the Muslim side. We'll look at some information from non-Muslims, and we'll try to make certain assertions about that. Okay, another claim by the Muslims about Muhammad would be this. Muhammad began having revelations from the angel Jibril in 610. These were memorized and passed on to his followers. Everything had to be oral because they were not writing things down. The Arabs were an oral community. Arabic at that time was very limited, as we shall see as we look at some of the letters later on. They also believe that 20 years after his death, these revelations were collected in what became known as the Qur'an. So again, this is what they would say, what they believe. However, the earliest mention of Muhammad is in 691 AD. This is according to the Muslims. The first indication by Muslims that there is a man named Muhammad was written in the Dome of the Rock in 691 when it was built. He may have been the Muhammad inscribed on a coin minted in 687. We're going to look at that in just a moment. But you see the picture of the Dome of the Rock here. It's a beautiful building. It's octagonal. It's built in the Byzantine style. It was built by Byzantine architects and workers. It is not a mosque. That front door actually faces Petra and not Mecca. So it's not a mosque that would have an exposure toward what Muslims would say would be the major city, Mecca. But all that's inside is a rock, because they believe that that's the rock where Muhammad made his famous trip on a winged horse and came to the farthest mosque, which would have been Jerusalem in their interpretation, though the Quran does not say Jerusalem. It just says the farthest mosque. So in this night journey, Muhammad supposedly rode this horse over 1,000 miles to Jerusalem, landed in this place of the rock. There he was taken up to heaven, and that's where he had the dialogue with Moses about how many times they should pray, and they whittled it down to 5. And of course, this is mostly in the Hadith, later stories. But this is where it would have taken place according to the tradition, though again, it's not mentioned in the Quran that it was Jerusalem, but they have built this dome as a commemoration to that, they say. But it could also be a commemoration to the victory of the Arabs over the Christians of Jerusalem, kind of a victory monument. But that was the first time that Muhammad was mentioned, and we'll look at some of those inscriptions a little bit later. Here are some possible references to Muhammad by non-Muslims. These were written earlier. They were little scattered phrases in certain documents, but we need to look at these and realize that there was something going on, some historical thread that we have to put together. The first one we'll look at is from the late 630s. So Muhammad was supposed to have died in 632. This was thought to have been written in 634. It's called the Doctrine of Jacobi, and it talks about an unarmed and still living Arabian, well, an armed Arabian, armed with a sword. And he went around and they were fighting against the people, the Christians. So you have an armed prophet fighting at that time, 2 years after Muhammad died. Now, it doesn't mention Muhammad's name. It just mentioned that this is an Arab prophet who is part of a group that is fighting these different battles in northern Arabia. In 638, you do have a historical source here with the Bishop of Jerusalem named Sophronius. He wrote a number of things, and he wrote about this invasion of Jerusalem and describes the invaders as barbaric and unreligious. He never calls the invaders Muslims. He never refers to Muhammad, the Quran, or Islam. But in 638, these Arabs basically took over Jerusalem. So that is an historic time, an historic event. In the early 640s, you have Thomas, the presbyter, a Christian priest, who mentions a battle between the Byzantines and the Tayyaye, the Mamet. Mamet was more of a Greek form of what we would suspect would be Muhammad. And this was east of Gaza in 634. So Gaza, of course, is up there right next to Israel, not down in Saudi Arabia. So you're talking about this battle against the Arabs, the Tayyaye of Muhammad. So who was this Muhammad that they were talking about? And then in the 660s, 670s, you have the Armenian bishop Sabaeus. So you notice that these are all Christian references. And he gives a semi-historical account of an Arab preacher named Mahomet, who taught his people to worship the God of Abraham and who led 12,000 Jews along with Arabs to invade Palestine. Now, who was this Mahomet? Could it have been the Muhammad of the Muslims, or could it have been a different prophet, a different leader? And there are a number of interesting theories that are coming about now, and I will be talking about some of those a little bit later. Who was this Mahomet? Was he the Muhammad of the Muslims, or was he someone else? And then you have some other sources. In 680, you have an anonymous chronicler who identifies Muhammad as the leader of the sons of Ishmael. Remember, the sons of Ishmael were descendants of Abraham, and we do have descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, who settled in northern Arabia. And they said that this chronicler says that God sent them against the Persians, and there were many of them, like the sand of the seashore. A lot of these Arabs, sons of Ishmael. So he mentions that. It doesn't mention Muhammad or Muslims, but the sons of Ishmael is interesting because the Muslims claim to be sons of Ishmael. That's still not determined. And that would be interesting because there are Arabs mentioned before Abraham. And of course, if Ishmael is a son of Abraham, he could not have been these original Arabs, which meant wanderers, nomads. That's what the term Arab means. Then the year 685, you have this renegade, Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, who opposed Abd al-Malik, who was the caliph at that time. And he went off and minted coins proclaiming Muhammad as the prophet of Allah. So this is the first time you have an actual Arab, not a Christian, minting coins, mentioning this name Muhammad as the prophet of Allah. So it's a very important historical thing to note. And this was 685, 686, 687, just what, 20, no, it'd be about 50 years after Muhammad's death. And so something's going on there, and we'll talk about possibilities in a little bit. And then in the 690s, you have the Coptic Christian Bishop Janosik, who is first recognized as using the term Muslims in what he writes. However, the document that is ascribed to him, written supposedly in 690, we do not have a copy of that until an Ethiopic version, the translation, which is dated 1602. We don't have the Arabic. We don't have the original. We don't have any of the early copies. So at that time, Muslims were very common. So they could have used the word, they could have taken the word Tayaye, which may have been in the original document of Janosik, and changed it into Muslims. At least that is a great possibility. So it is an interesting document, and it talks about these Arabs and some of the battles that they fought. Noteworthy is that the battles were up north, not in around Mecca, not in the Hijaz, but up around Syria. And we'll talk about why that would have occurred. And then 730s, you have the Christian writer John of Damascus, and he refers to Islamic theology in detail. In fact, he wrote Christian theology to try to encourage the Christians to understand better what Christians believe, so that they would be able to defend themselves against the new faith of these Arabs. Well, he talks about the writings of Muhammad in his heresy of the Ishmaelite. John of Damascus is the man that I spent 7 years studying as I dealt with my PhD dissertation. And fascinating man, brilliant, knew, of course, he wrote in Greek, but he knew Arabic and Syriac. Syriac was the language of religion in that area. And he was a very orthodox person in many ways. and a Christian, and he lived within the court of the caliph named Abd-al-Malik, one of the most powerful caliphs at that time. And so John was an eyewitness. He was writing earlier than any of the Muslims were writing that we're going to talk about later in the Hadith. And so he does not refer to the Quran. He does not refer to an actual book being formed, but he talks about writing, separate writings, as if it's still coming together, as if there are different stories that are circulating about this man, Mahmet. And because it's in Greek, he refers to him as Mahmed. So John gives us a lot of information that we need to deal with. Then you do have coins from that time. From the 640s to 650s, there's a coin in Palestine that bears the inscription Muhammad, but it depicts a figure holding a cross. And perhaps this Muhammad, it's interesting to note that the term Muhammad comes from the root Ahmed. Ahmed means praise, and Muhammad, the one who is praised. It can also mean the chosen one. So even on the Dome of the Rock, where it talks about Muhammad as the prophet of Allah, it could refer to the praised one, the chosen one of Allah. And there are some who believe that the Muhammad on the Dome of the Rock really refers to Jesus as the chosen one, because in many ways, as we shall see, those early followers who were not calling themselves Muslims yet and had Jews and Christians mixed with the other Arabs, call themselves mu'minin, or believers. But believers in what? It was kind of an intermediate type of religion. It wasn't Judaism, it wasn't Christianity, but it had a kind of a worship of Jesus. Jesus was was considered the great prophet. Could he have been the chosen one in their own understanding? The Muhammad that was the prophet, the chosen prophet of Allah, which is Arabic for God. Allah means the God. And it was a very common term. It was used well before Muhammad or the Arabs came around by the people who lived there in the Middle East. So it's not a unique word. It's not like Yahweh given to Moses. It is a general term for God. So here we have Muhammad. Was he the chosen one of Allah? Could that have referred to Jesus Christ? Well, here's a coin that is in that time period, the 640s, 650s, that refers to a Muhammad. So we'll keep that in mind. And there you see the cross being held by this particular person. Then in the 660s and 670s, we have a coin that depicts this man, Muawiyah. Muawiyah was the first historical caliph that we know of, the one that was written about. They talk about the first Rashidun. The Rashidun Caliphs would have been the ones who followed Muhammad when he died. He did not appoint any, so they took these others as ones that were favored by Muhammad. So you have Abu Bakr, who was his father-in-law. I remember Muhammad married Aisha when she was 9 years old. Well, that was Abu Bakr's daughter. So Abu Bakr was the first of these Rashidun Caliphs. And then Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And it was in the time of Uthman that they would have had the Quran written down, collected, and so on, according to their traditions. But we don't have any historical information, even on Ali, who, is revered by the Shiites. So what do we know about that time period? Muawiyah is the first caliph that we know of historically. And he was still it was a loose government that he had control of, but yet it was a wide span. I mean, in North Africa, all the way to Afghanistan, in bits and pieces, but primarily there in the Middle East. So Muawiyah had a lot of power, and he was minting coins. And you have still a coin that has a cross as well as a crescent. No, is he mixing? Is he trying to bring things together? Was Muawiyah one of these? And some say that Muawiyah was a Christian and that he was a heretical Christian, but he still believed that Jesus was a prophet. Perhaps. We're trying to put all this together. So here's another coin that from that early time period. And coins are important. There's another coin depicting Yazid. He was another caliph, and it featured a cross as well. Why would you have a cross? If this cross depicting Christ in the crucifixion was something that Muslims did not believe in at all, and in fact rejected violently at times, why would they put a cross on a coin depicting their reign, their power, their dominion? That would not make sense if they were Muslims according to the traditional Muslim account. And then you have this one by Zubair. Remember, Zubair was a rebel. He rejected Abd al-Malik. He wanted to be the caliph, and they had some battles, and Zubair was chased away. And it is said that Zubair, who was the governor of this city called Petra, which is a worship center, and may have been the original Mecca, but he was the governor there, and he stole the stone, the black stone, and took it down into Arabia, and that's where we are researching, and it may be the story that he is the one who took it down, and in hiding he went to what may have been a village or just a place that became later known as Mecca. So Mecca would not have been the place where Muhammad grew up, but it would have been perhaps the place that Zubair went down, put the stone into another Kaaba, a square building, which was very prevalent in Petra years before, because they used the Kaaba as their worship place. There are many Kaabas, there were worship places. And so he would have just taken that tradition, taken the black stone, gone down, and he was trying to set up his own kingdom. And so, of course, what you want to do is mint coins to show that you have power, that you want recognition. This is your calling card. This is saying to others that you are in charge. And so here you have a coin minted by Zubair, which actually has a picture of Khosrow, who is the Persian king of the past. And on the other side, they would have figures with the cross. So it's still very interesting. It's an intermediate time. This is the 680s. You're not talking about Muhammad at this time, really. And then you have Abd al-Malik. And Abd al-Malik was the one who came down firmly. He was a strong caliph. As I said, John of Damascus worked for him. John was a Christian who was collected taxes from the Christians. He was called a logothetes, or a tax collector. And so he was in the midst of all this. But here you have in the early 790s coins depicting Abd al-Malik, still featuring a human. But, you know, Muslims are known for not having images on their coins. And still in the time, the early time of Abd al-Malik, you have his image with his sons there. But on the back, where this particular coin was used by the Byzantines, it's the Byzantine pattern. And on the back, where you have this pole, it would have been a cross. On the Byzantine coins, there would have been a cross. So already Abd al-Malik has taken away the image of the cross. So there is an agenda, a very strong agenda that we see with Abd al-Malik. But that's in the 790s. And this is the first time you have written on this, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, is he referring to Muhammad as the chosen one, as perhaps Christ the prophet? Or is he referring to a different person? Because we'll see that Abd al-Malik may have had a lot to do with the formation of Islam. And then finally, one more coin here. 696, Abd al-Malik takes away the pictures, and you have just the words. And from that time on, Arabic coins only had words, not images. And here again, it features the Shahada, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And then also Abd al-Malik is responsible for the Dome of the Rock and the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock. What you see here in this beautiful Arabic calligraphy is not what was there in the time of Abd al-Malik. This was, I think, even in the 1600s, this final layover of the outside. But the original would have been carved inside. And here you have some of the inscriptions, and they do talk about things like, do not say three. There is a rejection of the Trinity. There is a rejection of Jesus as God himself. But again, when he mentions Muhammad as the prophet of Allah, could he have been referring to Jesus, the chosen one, but not Jesus as the Son of God, but still the chosen prophet? That's something that we're exploring more. And you see this right here in the rock inscriptions where he mentions this about there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So what you find also is another inscription dated in the year 216 of the Hijra, the Muslim calendar, which is in the 800s. It's just about 200 years after Muhammad. And it's from the commander of the faithful, the caliph at that time, Mamun al-Imam. And he says that he was the one who built this, put this in place. Could have been just the calligraphy of that time, or was it more? But you see the last line, it has the person who wrote or inscribed this, put in place by the hands of Salih Yahya. Yahya is a form of John, the Ali of commander of the faithful, in the month of Rabi al-Akhir of the year 216 al-Hijra, which was in the 800s. What was this doing on the Dome of the Rock? And but we know the Dome of the Rock was built in the 690s. We know the implications of Abd al-Malik, but it's really interesting to note something like this. What was really going on? Okay, some more claims of Muhammad. The third one, Muhammad was known as the last of the prophets and became the centerpiece of the religion that began through his leadership. That's what the Muslims believe. But it seems like it all began with Abd al-Malik. I really have enjoyed studying the time of Abd al-Malik, especially through the eyes of John of Damascus. It really seems like everything was starting to gel at this time. So it's likely that Muhammad is mostly the invention of the Caliph, Abd al-Malik. Why an invention? Abd al-Malik reigned 685 to 705. John was working for him from about 700 to 705. John's father was working as a logothetes, the tax collector under Abd al-Malik before that time. But here you have a picture on a coin, one of the earlier coins of Abd al-Malik, where he shows his picture. Was he referring to himself as the chosen one at that time? That's another theory that's around. Well, the caliph needed a prophet to be the mouthpiece of the scripture for his new religion. The Qur'an became the scripture and Islam became the religion. This is the thesis right now that we're following, that Abd al-Malik may have been the one who really formed this religion. Though there were battles, there were these Arabs were taking over many lands. Some of them were believers. There were Christians and Jews who were part of this marauding army of Arabs going through the Middle East, gaining a lot of territory, subduing. They took over Jerusalem in 638. They took over Damascus, Syria in 635. That's where John grew up. His grandfather was the one who surrendered the city. So there's a lot of legacy there. But looking at the formation of Islam, could it have come from the time of Abd al-Malik? Could he have looked around and said, okay, we've got all this power, but we don't have a full religion. We need a religion. All these great nations, the Byzantines, they have Christianity, and the Persians, they have Zoroastrianism. we need a religion, and for a religion we need scripture. So they could have been gathering scripture from, even before the time of Muhammad's supposed life, as we shall see from some references a little bit later. But anyway, he was pulling that together, and what he pulled together may have become the Quran, and Islam became the religion, and he needed a prophet. So he may have developed this idea of Muhammad as not just the chosen one, not just Jesus, referring back to Jesus as the chosen one, but perhaps Abd Malik developed the whole idea of Muhammad as a prophet. And then it would have had to have been redacted back to a place somewhere else because there is too much known. Abd Malik was in Damascus. He was not in Mecca. The Umayyad Empire, which was the first empire of the Muslims from Muawiyah, didn't take place in the Hijaz, in Arabia, in the middle of Arabia. No, it took place in Syria, many hundreds, over 1,000 miles to the north. Why? Why did they set up shop there? Perhaps because they were from that area, as we shall see. Okay, another claim on Muhammad. Muslims believe the life of Muhammad was lived out in the full light of history, as I said. They have this biographical information, which is called the Sirat Rasulallah, the life of the prophet, the life of Muhammad. And they say it dates from about 125 years after the death of Muhammad. They would call this the first biography, written by Ibn Ishaq, who they say had a grandfather who was a Christian, enslaved in Mecca. But this is tradition. And there are scholars who say, well, this whole biography is just probably pious fiction that sought to give context to the Quran, because the Quran does not have much context. You have very few cities named, and most of them are up north, not in Arabia, North Arabia, much closer to Israel, in Jordan, what is now Jordan. And the context was not there. But there's a problem, because this didn't happen like this. So the earliest biographical information about Muhammad really dates from over 200 years after, not 125, because Ibn Ishaq is perhaps an author, but we don't have anything from Ibn Ishaq. The earliest we have is from a rendition by a man named Ibn Hisham, who said he took the writings of Ibn Ishaq, weeded out what he didn't like, because he said, oh, there are some things in here that are just not very nice about Muhammad, and we don't want those. So he wrote his own version. But it may have been that Ibn Hisham really wrote the first version and just made up this story about Ibn Ishaq, because we don't have any document. We don't have any copy from Ibn Ishaq. So that's something to keep in mind. It may be that we don't have anything written about Muhammad biographically until 200 years after, because Ibn Hisham died in 833. So he would have written this in the early 9th century, in the early 800s. 200 years after Muhammad would have died. That's like taking something about George Washington now and trying to write a book on George Washington without any notes, without any letters, without anything coming down from the people who would have known George Washington, or even grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on of George Washington. There may have been some oral stories, because that's what the Muslims say, the oral stories came down, but we wouldn't have any record of that. And how do you know that these oral stories were not made up? Like the cherry tree, Washington cutting down the cherry tree. That's considered a fable, a myth. And yet it's something that a lot of children hear about. So anyway, you have problems like that, even in the biographical material on Muhammad. So what other claim do they make? Number 5, Muhammad was already a revered prophet and a model of moral conduct for his followers, they say. But most, if not all, the deeds and the sayings of Muhammad were fabricated hundreds of years after his death, and what are called the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. And there are many of them, as I said. And here you have the hadith of al-Bukhari, the probably the most famous ones, but they were not written until late 800s, well over 200 years later. So how trustworthy are they? Especially since most of them were thrown out by al-Bukhari, and then now even Muslims are throwing out. In fact, just recently, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who's very much a progressive there in Saudi Arabia, has a lot of ideas for the future of Islam. And one of the things he recognizes is that the image of Saudi Arabia needs to change in regard to the world's view, and they need to get rid of the radical element of Islam. And so he is recognizing that much of the radical element takes its cue from the hadith, from the stories of Muhammad and what he did, the battles, the treachery, the executions. All of that is written in either the biographies, which are 200 years after, or the hadith, which are written down 200 years after. But still, these are the stories that a lot of Muslims follow. And the Crown Prince says, we've got to get rid of that. In fact, we've got to get rid of most of the hadith because they are not in line with the Quran. He's saying that Islam needs to go right back to the Quran and the Quran only. And that's really limiting Islam. But yet in the Quran, there are many of these verses that talk about making war on the infidel, the Christians, those who claim that Jesus is the Son of God. So it's no better, but that's what's happening in Arabia. Just a couple of weeks ago, he came out with that. So lots going on that we need to keep up with. Also, the name Muhammad only appears in the Quran 4 times, and 3 times it seems to recognize this person as praised one. Could that also be a reference to Jesus, the praised one? Now, you do have other terms that are considered to relate to Muhammad by Muslims, and you have Messenger of Allah, Rasulullah. It's about 300 times in the Quran, and Prophet or Nabi is also 43 times. That seems to be, according to the Muslims, in reference to Muhammad. So they would say, oh, Muhammad is all through the Quran, but he's only mentioned, the name is only mentioned 4 times. And as I said, 3 times it could be this nebulous chosen one, praised one, that could include Jesus Christ. So now the question would be, are these all references to Muhammad of the Muslims? And we're going to find out more about the Quran in just a few minutes. So when we look at Muhammad, he is probably some kind of historic person, perhaps even prophetic in the desert way, but probably nothing more than a Maghazi leader, a leader of the raids, the caravan raids, and so on, who was later used by Abd al-Malik for his propaganda. And there's an interesting historical figure named Iyas ibn Qabisa, who may be this particular character that Abd al-Malik would have referenced or built upon, because he was a governor of an area under the Persians, and then he rebelled or rejected them, but he was known by a nickname, Muhammad, the chosen one. And this is in the time of when Muhammad would have been living, because in the early 600s. So look for this name in the future, Iyas ibn Qabisa. Could he have been the one that they claimed was the Muhammad that became the Muhammad for the Muslims, but yet was a very different historical person? A leader, yes. A governor, yes. A political person, yes. But the Muhammad of the Quran, no. Now let's look at the Quran for a few minutes. This is what Toby Lester says in an article, very good article, What is the Quran? Question comes up, what if the Quran is not divine? It's supposed to be eternal. It's supposed to be directly from Allah. If the Quran is not directly from God, then it is a human document written by humans, made up by humans. And since it claims a perfect divine source, human authorship would undercut its authority. And so Humphreys, another writer, states boldly, quote, if the Quran is a historical document, then the whole Islamic struggle of 14 centuries is effectively meaningless, because it would not be true. It would not be accurate. It would not be from God. It would be made up. And perhaps, as I said, a lot of it could have been made up in the time of Abd-al-Malik. So that's what we have to pursue. What does the historical critique tell us? Robert Spencer says this in his book, Did Muhammad Exist? In his groundbreaking and complex work, Wansbrough, another scholar who wrote on this, postulated that the Quran was developed primarily to establish Islam's origins in Arabia, and that the Hadith were fabricated in order to give the Arabian Empire a distinctive religion so as to foster its stability and unity. As I said before, in the time of Abd-al-Malik, he would have seen all these things coming together, and he needed a man, a book, and a place. The man of the book especially, and the religion, and the place came later. Spencer goes on, if Abd-al-Malik built up the Islamic religion for political purposes, then the earlier silence from all quarters about Muhammad, remember there's nothing from the Muslims until 691, until Abd-al-Malik, unless you take in Zubair, and that's an interesting parallel that may have another interesting story to tell about that. Then the earlier silence from all quarters about Muhammad, Islam, and the Quran can be explained very simply, Spencer says. There was no reference to these things because Muhammad, Islam, and the Quran did not exist yet, or did so only in an inchoate state, or a undeveloped state, an indeterminate state, an intermediate state. And that's why I talked about an intermediate religion that became Islam. It had elements of Judaism and Christianity because it seems like the Quran used a lot of the Jewish stories and scriptures from the Old Testament, New Testament, but they were Arabized. They were not the same. And you have to ask yourself, why, if we had the Bible for all these hundreds of years before the Quran, why are these stories different? Why do they not match up? And why do they use apocryphal ideas that were not written down for hundreds of years after the New Testament was written? Those are good questions to ask. And then with the Quran, excuse me. Another thing they say here, Muhammad began having the revelations in 610, and these were memorized and passed on to the followers, and this became the Quran. So it was memorized. They also talk about people writing down little portions, little surahs, or ayahs, verses on pieces of bone or scraps of paper. They didn't have paper in this way that we had it. Later, it was written down on animal skins, and those were something that would last a lot longer than the papyrus, the Egyptian paper that a lot of the New Testament was written on. It would dissolve in 100 years or so. But for the Muslims, they would have memorized these things. At least that's what the tradition says. And they would also say these revelations were collected in what became known as the Quran. Well, the Quran probably, according to the historical critique, probably took its present shape not in the middle of the 7th century, but probably not until late in the 8th century, if not into the 9th century. This is over 200 years after Muhammad's death. How do you explain that? What do you say about this gap? What were they using for their word from Allah? Well, if it's oral, then what were they saying? What were they passing on? You have some interesting parts of Quranic-like verses on the Dome of the Rock, 691. So they were using some kind of text, or they had some kind of scripture in mind. John of Damascus at that time reflects on how it is different. Some of it's different from what became the Quran later on. Another claim by the Muslims, number 2 for the Quran as a revealed book was written down in Arabic within 20 years of Muhammad, within 20 years. Well, full Arabic was not really developed until later in the 7th century, and especially the dots and the certain symbols that gave it the extra letters. It only had 16 actual letters or consonants. They were all consonants. Everything would have been written in consonants, so you wouldn't have the vowels, the a, e, u, e, o. Those were put in later or developed later to distinguish what the word would be. So if you have DVD, is it David or is it some other name? If you only have the consonants, you cannot know fully. Al-Hajjaj, who was a governor under Abd-al-Malik, was known to have developed these particular, a number of these particular indications. So now you have the 28 letters in Arabic, but at that time, in the time of Abd-al-Malik or the earlier part, you did not have this. It all would have been in just early consonants. The earliest form of the Quran was probably derived from, this is interesting, Christian liturgy and Jewish commentary, which is called the Targum, at first in Syriac and other foreign languages. This is a theory. This is an idea. Would it have been developed? Because it has a lot of Christian stories in it. A majority, a good portion of the Quran is a retelling of stories about Moses and other prophets that are found in the Old Testament. Of the 26 prophets that are actually named in the Quran, about 21 of them are from the Old and New Testament. They're Christian and Jewish prophets. And you have a couple of other names that would have come from the Arab tradition. So that makes a very interesting point as well. And yet they talk about many thousands of prophets, but they only name those 26. Well, these were carried orally and subsumed in Arabic formats, these stories, Christian stories and Jewish stories, though retaining much of the former structure and phraseology, especially if it's in Syriac. Syriac is very close to Arabic, and Syriac was the common language. It was the Greek of that area in a sense, especially for religious worship. And it was also written in consonants like Hebrew, like Arabic, and yet it was much more developed. It had a theological vocabulary. And it could have been that these early verses, especially the Christian ones, would have been written in Syriac, and then that Syriac transliterated into Arabic, and that became part of the Quran. And there are some really interesting comparisons that show the likelihood of that. And there are foreign words, Syriac words, Greek words, and other words that are in the Quran. Well, if the Quran was supposedly etched in stone, eternally past, and always there with Allah in heaven, and it's supposed to be in Arabic, why would it have these terms in Syriac and Greek and other languages that came later if Arabic was the original language and the only language? That doesn't make sense. Okay, early forms of written Arabic came from two possible sources: Christian missionaries producing a script from Syriac liturgy, and merchants developing that script for simple economic transactions. This is very interesting. Where did the Arabic writing come from if it was an oral culture? Well, just like Wycliffe missionaries do today, they go into a place that doesn't have a written language. They study the language, they come up with an alphabet, and they develop the written language so that they can translate the Bible into that language and then teach the people to read that language and therefore read the Bible. Well, could this have referred to early Wycliffe missionaries who were taking the Syriac and coming up with an Arabic form so that they could then reach out to the Arabs. There was not an Arab, even in this early stage, there was not an Arab New Testament until the 800s, and that was problematic. It would have been perhaps very different if they did have a Christian New Testament in Arabic that they would have been able to understand. Good for the Wycliffe missionaries, we need them. Both forms of the script probably were based on Syro-Aramaic or Syriac and Nabatean scripts. Nabatean scripts. The Nabateans were Arabs that lived up around Petra, which is in a portion of southern Jordan, right near Israel. And the Nabatean language was very much developed. In fact, there are scholars, many scholars, who say that Arabic, the written Arabic that we have today, came from a Nabatean script. And the Nabateans, many of them were Christians. Were they the ones who developed this language further and developed an alphabet for the Arabs so that they could preach Christ to them? And then that later was pulled in, some of those stories, some of the Christian stories were in liturgy from the Christian churches that used Syriac. Could they have been pulled in to form the early portion of the Quran? Because remember, scholars say that it was probably not finalized until late in the 8th century, early 9th century. So that was still well over 150 to 200 years after Muhammad's death, still in process until then. This is an interesting quote dealing with Gunter Lulling, who delved into this and studied it. And he maintains that the original Quran was not an Islamic text at all, but a pre-Islamic Christian document. Lulling believes that the Quran reflects a theology of a non-Trinitarian Christian sect that left traces on Islamic theology, notably in its picture of Christ and its uncompromising Unitarianism. Remember, the Unitarians would not believe the same. They are not Trinitarians. They don't believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They believe in just one God. So it may have been a type of Unitarian form of religion that took over, that was predominant in the mind of Abd Malik and his followers. And that's why on the Dome of the Rock, they would say, do not say three. Don't talk about the Trinity. We don't believe that. That's wrong. Don't say that Jesus is God himself. Jesus was a prophet. And so they could have had a form of this. So it's very interesting. Then you have this scholar, Gerd Quinn. Gerd Quinn is a German philologist, studies language. And he was called to go down to Sana'a, Yemen in the early 70s, because they found all these old Qurans in an attic of an old mosque, and they were falling apart, but they were some of the earliest that we ever have found. And so he was in on this, and he translated a lot of them. And this is what he says about that work. Quote, my idea is that the Quran is a kind of cocktail of texts that were not all understood even at the time of Muhammad. Many of them may even be 100 years older than Islam itself. Even within the Islamic traditions, there is a huge body of contradictory information, including a significant Christian substrate. One can derive a whole Islamic anti-history from them if one wants. The Quran claims for itself that it is mubin, or clear, clear in understanding, clear in language. But if you look at it, you will notice that every 5th sentence, 20% of the Quran or so, simply doesn't make sense. Many Muslims will tell you otherwise, of course, but the fact is that a 5th of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. Doesn't make any contextual sense at all. And he goes on, this is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable into any language. That is why Muslims are afraid. Since the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but is not, there is an obvious and serious contradiction. Something else must be going on. What is going on with the Quran? Well, the Muslims say the Quran was written in Arabic, pure and clear, And this is in the Quran, Surah 16, verse 103, pure and clear. But here you have a scholar outside of Islam, sure, but he says that 20% of the Quran doesn't make sense, even in the best translations or best renditions of the Quran, of the Arabic. Also, there are over 100 non-Arabic terms in the Quran. Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Syrian, Akkadian, Ethiopian, and Persian words are used. How could that be if it was eternally written in Arabic and there's not supposed to be any words changed at all? So the Quran would have been written before any of these languages came about. And yet you have it in this eternal document. That's always puzzled me as to why Muslims would say that, would claim that. Even the word Quran, this is interesting, probably comes from the Syrian word Kuryana, which means lectionary, and usually refers to Christian lectionaries. Because remember, as I said, some of these things in the Quran may have come from Christian lectionaries, and that could have been the origin of what became the Quran later on, as more and more was added, because people like Abdul Malik realized, oh, we need our own text for our own religion, and we need a prophet for our religion. And so all of this was borrowed from Christians and Jews and others. And then Mingana, a scholar on this area of Syriac and the Arabic, he said almost all the religious terms in the Quran are derived from Syriac. Remember, Syriac was the religious language of that area. And why would you have Syriac theological terms if Arabic was the original language and it was supposedly the only language when it was written down on that rock or the table in heaven? Again, it doesn't fit. Syriac was the language of the religious terms. So 20% of the Quran is not understandable, even to experts in Arabic. Even Arabic people, even Muslims will give in to this and say, yeah, there are quite a few verses that just don't make sense. Another scholar, Christoph Luxemburg, demonstrates that it makes more sense when it is translated back into Syriac. His claim is that a lot of the Quran was first in Syriac, Christian liturgy and so on, but in Syriac, and because it's similar, it's in consonants, it would have been transliterated into Arabic, a sister type language, and then that became part of the Quran. So the earliest biographies seem to be written to give context to the Quran and provide details that are not in the Quran. The hadith were later likely invented later to provide more context to Quranic verses. So all of this would have been redacted back into a backstory of something that would have happened 100, 200 years before, but it didn't happen. It was perhaps made up, put together to make the claim of the man, the book, and later the location. So it may be that the Quran was not originally written in Arabic at all, but was eventually rendered in Arabic as the new religion was being developed. And that's Robert Spencer again. Then he also makes this claim. The Quran itself betrays evidence of having been adapted from a Christian text. So again, that Syriac text. Let's take that a step further. Luling states that about a third of the Quranic text is based on an originally pre-Islamic Christian text, a third of it coming from Christian sources. And then Christoph Luxemburg says this. He refers to the word her or huri, which is also in Zoroastrian, in Persian. And it's usually translated as virgins, large-eyed, wide-eyed, or lustrous-eyed. And these are the virgins that are supposedly in paradise waiting for those valiant terrorist warriors who are killed in jihad. And then they will be translated into heaven directly to claim their 72 virgins, their 72 huris. Well, it could be that the translation is a little bit off, because if it was Syriac originally, then it may just refer to white grapes, beautiful white grapes in the garden, hanging above the people who are able to eat of them, these succulent grapes. Huris as grapes? Can you imagine the face of those terrorists who, when they get to heaven, they're given their box of raisins? Maybe there were 72 raisins in there. I don't want to make light of that, but what's going on here? Do we really know where the Quran came from and how it was developed and how it was put together, patched together? A lot of it doesn't make sense. But they also claim this: there are no variant readings, lost verses, or conflicting readings on various texts. In other words, the Quran is perfect. Letter by letter, it's the same as when it was first written down under Uthman, 20 years after Muhammad. That's the claim. But there are many variant readings. Arthur Jeffrey gives 90 pages of these variant readings. The Yemeni Qurans that Guru Quinn was able to work with reveal that the Muslim claim of a uniform text can no longer be made. And an earlier colleague of mine, Keith Small, wrote a brilliant book, Textual Criticism in Quran Manuscripts, where he showed that there are many textual variants in the Quran. That should not be so if it was a perfect book. And now Dan Brubaker, another expert in this field, has taken that scholarship upon himself, and he's furthered it in many ways, and he's written on this topic as well. And then just to make a few things about Islam, they say that Mecca was a birthplace of Islam, but probably it was Petra. There's a lot of scholarship going on in this field, and if it was not Mecca, you see Mecca way down there in the lower arrow, and Petra way up there by Israel and Jordan. Petra is the canyon of the half moon that's in Indiana Jones. It's a place of worship. It's a place where there are many graves etched into these sandstone caves. But it used to be the center of the Nabatean kingdom, where they would do their worship, where they had the Kaabas, and there are remnants of the foundations of these Kaabas. And it's also said that Zubair stole the black stone from Petra. Could it be that Petra was the original Mecca, and Mecca was later developed and as an after fact, a retrofit to the whole story. Islam began through a series of revelations to Muhammad, they say, probably out of an apocalyptic Judaism, at least an intermediate monotheism that was neither Jewish or Christian, as I said, but still centered on Abraham and Ishmael. Why Ishmael? Because Ishmael was known perhaps as one of the earlier Arabs, but you trace his ancestry and you find some very different outcomes. I would challenge you to look at that. Number 3, Islam as a religion was fully formed by the time Muhammad died. It was fashioned really for political purposes. It's not a religion, wholly a religion. It's very political. It's very much a socioeconomic type of format, much like well, I would say Marxism, because of its control over people. Allah is the one God, but the followers are to submit. Muslims, the ones who submit to Allah, they are the slaves of Allah. They are not free in Allah. In the time of Abd al-Malik, the need for legitimacy for their government was understood. To be a credible government, they needed a formalized religion, a scripture, and a prophet, the man, the book, and the religion, and later the location. So I see it as an intermediate monotheism that came in the 700s, developed as an amalgamation of Jewish and Christian influences, but not directly an outcome. A heresy, yes. That over time, because of influence from these heretical, unorthodox Christian views, monophysite Nestorian to some degree, even though these monophysite Nestorians are within the realm of Christianity, they would have had offshoots from them. And these doctrines were incorporated in a form that rejected the Trinity and the deity of Christ. And that's the core idea of Islam. It was a rejection of Trinitarian Christianity. It still is, very much. And there was also a stronger Jewish element that pushed this agenda, but after the conquest started up, this was also marginalized and in time vilified in future writings. It's interesting because the Jews were very much a part of this early movement. The Jews, Christians, they all formed these early raiding parties, but then something happened, and there are historical reasons for that. This intermediate monotheism could have come from an earlier form of Ebionism, which was influenced by Arianism, which said that Jesus was a created being, not God himself. So it could have come from a heretical influence. And then Islam claims that the Arabs were pagans before Muhammad came and Muhammad changed them. But there are a lot of remnants of Christian and Jewish writings and beliefs in that area, even in the Hijaz, further south in Yemen especially. Islam, they say, began with the Hijra, or the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in 622. But Hijra also means just immigration. And after the Byzantines conquered the Persians in 622, because remember 622 is the magic time when Islam is founded. Everything goes back to 622. And they say that that's when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina and started his kingdom. But this is when the Byzantines conquered the Persians, and the Byzantines then gave over the land back to the Arabs who were working for them. They were called federates or mercenaries in a sense, and they were fighters. And these Arabs didn't have anything to do. They were no longer paid by the Byzantines. They needed money, so they started raiding others. And these raids developed, it seems, to have to the point where Abd-al-Malik comes along later on and pulls all this together and helps create this religion and prophet and holy book. And we're coming close to an end here. Number 6, the words Islam and Muslim are part of the inscription around the Dome of the Rock. They are, but Muslims were not called Muslims until the middle of the 8th century, really. They were called Maghreb, for the Arabic term Muhajirun, those who were on a Hajj, or immigrants. They're leaving, they're moving. So they were called Maghreb, which is Syriac, or Muhajirun, which is Arabic. They're also known as Mu'minin, or believers, but believers in what? It wasn't specified at that time in the 7th century. The Arabs were not called Muslims until the middle of the 8th century. They were known as Muhajirun, Mu'minin, Saracens out of Sarah, Hagarenes from Hagar, or Ishmaelites from ancestors of Ishmael, but not Muslims. The Dome of the Rock inscriptions could be an expression of the theologically uncomplicated Arab monotheism that is deeply concerned with Christ and Christianity, to the point of polemicizing against claims of Christ's divinity. Oh, he's not God himself, but he is an important prophet. He is the chosen one. He is the Muhammad. Perhaps this preoccupation with Christ leaves us far short of Islam in any clear, recognizable form as a religion of Muhammad and the Quran. By that point in history, the specifics of that religion still had been nowhere elaborated. And that's from Robert Spencer. And this is my conclusion to the whole thing. The best evidence we have today seems to reveal a slow development of the Quran from non-Muslim sources, primarily Syriac, that were adopted and incorporated into an intermediate monotheism that was neither Christian nor Jewish, but which was influenced by beliefs from both. At first, it was the religion of the elite, but as the Arabs became more successful and began to settle in their conquered cities, like Damascus and Jerusalem, the leaders recognized that they would need to fortify their hegemony, their power over the others, by establishing their religious beliefs, authorizing their own scriptures, and supporting their own prophet, the book, the man, and the religion. For many Christians at that time, like John of Damascus, this new religion was understood as just a heresy of Christianity with anti-Christian beliefs and a false prophet. And that's why he wrote his treatise called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. He didn't call them Muslims. He called them Saracens as well. but not Muslims. As time went on, however, written in Arabic, as well as the scripture written in Arabic, became standardized, and Muhammad became established in a religion that would soon rival Christendom. And now it makes up over 20%, almost 23% of the population. Christians make up 33%, a third. 1 out of every 3 people in the world claim to be Christians. 1 out of every 5 people in the world claim to be Muslims. Well, that's what I have to say. Here are the 2 books that I've written on this. The one on the left, The Guide to Answering Islam, Everything a Christian Needs to Know About Islam and the Rise of Radical Islam. Goes through all the historical critique that I talked about. It deals with the beliefs and practices. It deals with the Crusades, the Jihad, the ISIS, what ISIS was all about. And it deals also, more importantly, about how to reach out to Muslims with the truth through love. And that's what that book is about. The other one, John of Damascus, was what I wrote on my dissertation. It's a deep dive historically on the historical critique of that time. So that is all that I have. And so I will stop sharing. Back to you all. Sorry that I took longer than 60 minutes.
Oh, do not
don't
apologize. That
apologize.
was so excellent. Matter of fact, I was thinking it was much shorter than an hour until I looked at the clock.
Well,
But very excellent presentation, and I really appreciate you coming on board. Appreciate your ministry, and we will be keeping you in prayers because, you know, it's very crucial that we get the word out on how to witness to Muslims and win them to Christ, because we don't want to see anybody dying and going to hell and spending an eternity without God. I just wanted to know if there's any questions in the audience or any questions on Facebook or on YouTube.
All right, if anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat and we'll read it out. And I noticed that Don is here, who was a speaker on one of our previous programs. So I wanted to see if Don had any comments or questions.
Questions. Yeah. Who's your best doctoral student, Dr. Janosik? That's my first question.
well, since I have a person named Don Deal, who's one of my doctoral students, I better say Don Deal, right?
Well, if you want to keep getting the golf hats, yeah.
The bribes, huh? No.
By the way, I'm reading a book right now on the Dome of the Rock, and everything you see, the outside and inside, all the script and everything dates till after 1958.
Whoa.
Is it that? Okay, I knew there was a great major renovation in the 1800s.
Yeah, 1958, they started the major renovation. So everything you see is after 1958.
Right.
The only originals, the inside, the walls, not the scripts or anything. The facade on the inside and outside is completely redone and new.
Yeah. So it's a lot less, but it is still there. You just have to be able to go in, and of course there are books that have that particular script. So that's not a problem, but it's something we need to learn much more about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you see it's the earliest positively dated written form of the Qur'an, and they refer to it as a paraphrase of the Qur'an because it doesn't match the received text, it kind of makes you suspicious that maybe there wasn't a settled text at the time, as you've elucidated in many different ways.
Yeah. And what John of Damascus mentions of what he knows of the sayings of Muhammad, he's writing about 730. So after the Dome of the Rock's been there, but he's been working for Abd al-Malik, and what he says of these Quranic phrases is different from the Quran as well, and more. It's like he was at the Dome of the Rock and he memorized those things, and that's what he's speaking about.
This brings up a question I have about the Dome of the Rock. You mentioned that it's a shrine and not a mosque. What is it a shrine to? Why is it there? Does it tell us?
Remember that when the trade towers were destroyed in 9/11, And the Muslims wanted to build a mosque in sight of that.
Right.
And they were raising money and applying for all the permits and everything like that. Fortunately, people recognized that what that would mean is that they were putting up a victory place and saying, we have brought down America by this. So it's very likely that the Dome of the Rock, which is not a mosque, it's not built in the form of a mosque. It doesn't have a qibla. It's not a place where they go in and pray. It is probably just a victory monument, in the sense that Abdul Malik, he was in Syria, in Damascus. Why didn't he put it in Damascus? He wanted to show that he had control over Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a holy city. Now you have the three main faiths there: Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and there, a lot of conflict, but that was probably to show that he was the boss, just like the minting of the coins and having at first his face. And the last coin that I showed, which showed that Abd Malik still had an image on there by himself, and it could be that he was referring to himself as the Muhammad, the praised one, the chosen one, to serve God in the form that he saw. But that's just another theory that we're dealing with. A lot of it's still to come together. It's been an exciting time. As I said, Dr. J. Smith and I have been teaching these courses that deal with this at Veritas Seminary, and we've had a lot of good interest there. I also teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where Scott has taken a course, and both schools were founded by Norman Geisler, the great apologist, and they will both do well in teaching apologetics to Islam. And we're learning a lot of new things. This has been an exciting year.
Yeah, it seems like the more we dig into the history of Islam, the worse it gets. But the more we dig into the history of Christianity, the better it gets. Can you comment on the historicity of Jesus, since we were talking about the book, the man, and the place? Can we talk about the Bible, Jesus, and the Jerusalem where these things happened? Obviously, we don't need to do. I mean, there's lots of archaeology going on in and around Jerusalem, and compare that briefly to the situation with the book, the man, and the place in Islam. Can you give us a couple of minutes on that, please?
Let me start off with just comparing Mecca and Jerusalem, because our faith, Christianity, is very much substantiated by archaeological findings. I mean, you can't go far in Israel, in these places where certain things were said to happen, where you find all kinds of artifacts. But in Mecca, you would think, if this is the mother of all cities, if it was supposed to be the center of worship, and the caravans would divert from the caravan route on the top of the plains and go down 1,000 meters down, it's a kilometer, in altitude, to go to this city, Mecca, to worship, and then go back up to get back up on the trail to go to Medina, which would be the next part on this trail. When Mecca did not have enough water, it had one little well. How could it sustain even a city's worth of people? And now, when you look at pictures of Mecca, and I encourage any of you to look up what Mecca is looking like now, because it is covered with concrete and asphalt, and they are building skyscrapers all over the place, because another plan of this crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is to make Saudi Arabia the center of the world. And in Mecca, you have this one giant skyscraper that's 4th largest in the world, and it has a clock tower. That clock is so big on 4 sides, and it's supposed to rival the clock at Big Ben. And remember, Greenwich time is England. That's the 0-degree longitude. It's the 0 mark of time. And there you see what they're doing there. You see the Kaaba underneath, and you see all that, the building. They are covering everything in Mecca. They destroyed the traditional house of Muhammad and Khadijah. Hey, these are historical places. Why did they do that? Perhaps because they would have found out that they were not 8th century or 7th century, but 9th century houses. That would have taken away from the whole idea that Mecca was there. There are no artifacts. Archaeologists have said that there are no artifacts before the 8th century AD. So there you have Christianity and Judaism much more substantiated, because you have all of these places in Jerusalem well documented by archaeological findings that go back thousands of years. You don't even have that in Mecca. Then you deal with the scriptures. The Qur'an, as I showed, was probably a mishmash of a lot of these Christian documents, a lot of stories. You have the stories of the 7 sleepers, the Greek story, and written in the 3rd century AD, of these Christian young men going into a cave to elude persecution, because they were persecuted at that time. They slept for a couple hundred years. They come out and they go to the city to buy food, and they're perplexed because their money is old. It's 300 years old. And they find that everybody believes in Christianity. So it's very different. And then the scriptures, of course, the Christian scriptures are verified. We have thousands of manuscripts that go all the way back to early to the 1st century, the 2nd century AD. And you have the traditions of Paul saying, hey, these things were, people do not dispute that Paul wrote, like Galatians, and it was probably written within 20 years of Christ's death. And that he talks about people at that time having these scriptural sayings or phrases or even hymns like Philippians 2, where it talks about God and Jesus being one, that these were early phrases. And so you have scripture that goes all the way back, and it's verified by all these copies. You can't do that with the Quran. The Quran breaks down. And then the man, Jesus was corroborated by at least 17 non-Christians in the time. You have Suetonius, you have Pliny the younger, you have even the Jewish
Josephus.
Thank you. Josephus, talking about Christus and his crucifixion. They don't dispute that he was crucified, that he lived, that he was crucified, that he died. Now, these non-Christians don't say that he rose from the dead, but the scriptures give great testimony to that. And for the Muslims to have one verse in the Quran that says, well, it appears like Jesus didn't die on the cross, and therefore they say that he was taken up into heaven without dying, and therefore the Christian scriptures, especially all that's in the Gospels, is just wrong. It doesn't hold, because the Quran is not substantiated, not like the scriptures. So Scott, that's a very good question, and that gives us the confidence we have as Christians to know that the man Christ was more than a man. He was testified as being God himself. And there's great testimony to that fact. And then you have the Bible being inspired, and it's tested time after time after time. And so Christianity holds fast to that. You can't say that about Islam. You can't say that about Muhammad. And you certainly can't say that about the Quran. But,
Excellent. Thank you.
so as Jay Smith says to all Muslims, come on home to Jesus.
Amen.
Because he is the man, we have the book, and Christianity is the way.
Right. I was wanting to know, do you not think this could be a positive of this prince in Saudi Arabia trying to open up the world, maybe getting rid of the 7th century mindset? And, you know, if they're going to become the center of the earth or the center of the planet in education, they're going to have to bring Christian leaders, they're going to have to bring Jewish people, even atheist people, which, you know, they kill them in Saudi Arabia now. So do you not think this would have a positive impact if he's successful in Saudi Arabia?
Definitely, because what he's going to do is bring Muslims away from this strong devotion to Muhammad, to the Quran, and almost secularize them. And when you do that, and you say that you've got to think, because he's saying to the Muslims, ijtihad, or reason, is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Not just following. You've got to reason, you've got to look at the Quran, and you've got to interpret it for yourself. What he's saying is very good, but as Muslims start doing that, and they start being confronted by the historical critique that I've been talking about, that Dr. Jay Smith is also very keen on, then they're going to be like this one former Muslim that we just met a couple weeks ago. And this person is interested in taking the master's degree because they have realized that, well, they were a Muslim, born in a Muslim country, now in the States. And as they were confronted with these things, they realized that Islam could not hold up. And they came to a point, especially as they listened to one of the videos by Jay Smith, they realized that they could no longer believe in Islam. So they turned away and they became a Christian. So hopefully that will happen with a lot of Muslims as well. When they have the freedom, just like if they took away the death penalty for apostasy, there is, I think it was Kawadawi, one of the Muslim leaders, who said, if death for apostasy were not a part of Islam, there would not be Islam today. That is saying a lot. In other words, the fear of death for leaving Islam keeps a lot of Muslims, at least within the realm of Islam. And something like what the Crown Prince is doing would kind of alleviate that, because they'll get to the point where they have to go with international law and say, okay, we can't do that. Freedom of religion, true freedom of religion, you can believe what you want. That will bring so many Muslims out of Islam, and hopefully most of them into Christianity. That's what we have to be ready for. That's why we need to study apologetics to Islam. We need to be ready to answer the questions and to pursue Muslims and with truth and love. Teach them the truth about what they believe and the truth about what Christians believe, and then show them the love of God as well. You've got to build those relationships.
Right. I think your book, John of Damascus, would be an excellent video presentation as well.
Especially when dealing with the heresy of the Ishmaelites. What I focused on was, and in that book, I have a translation of that particular treatise that he wrote, within 100 years of the death of Muhammad, well before any of these so-called biographies of Muhammad or hadith were collected. John of Damascus was writing about what he knew about this man, Muhammad. And so, yeah, that would be an interesting topic.
Some of the things we read for class involved what was written by the early Christian apologists to Muslims, including John and others. And I was fascinated to see the insights that they had, because they were much closer to the source. They were living among the early Muslims, and they had really interesting things to say. And I think a lot of that knowledge has perhaps been lost or forgotten that we can recover. So that's a great that you have that book there. By the way, I'll put the information, links to the books and Veritas course, anything else that we have, and DanielJanosik.com. That will all be in the description box for anyone who's watching the replay.
Appreciate that, Scott.
And I want to share one thing with all the Christians who are watching, and Muslims, atheists, anybody, something that I learned in class with Dr. Janosik. We were required to write a research paper, and I did my research paper on the time of Jahiliyyah, the supposed time of ignorance before Muhammad came along and reworked the culture of the Arabian Peninsula to be modern and progressive. This is yet another myth that they have in Islam. And in my research, I learned that there had been Jewish tribes there in the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. And there were lots of Christians living there, not nearly so long, but they were there. There was lots of material culture. There was advanced buildings. There was inscriptions and writing. There was an advanced culture. And in fact, the polytheism, the pagan religions were on their way out, being replaced by monotheisms, including Jewish monotheisms, Christian monotheisms, and so forth. And I have this quote that I included in my paper that I want to share with you, because this is it made such an impact to me when I saw it. This author says, one can speculate that Arabia possibly would have become a Christian country during the late 6th to early 7th century had Muhammad not appeared on the scene. In other words, the Arabian Peninsula was on its way to becoming either Jewish or Christian or something like that when Islam started to spread and took over. So if, it should happen that in our lifetime, we get to see the collapse of Islam, that stronghold, it would be finally, seeing that territory that's been lost for the kingdom of Christ regained after 1400 years. Hopefully it won't have to wait another generation before it happens. So we're very pleased that there are people like Dr. Janosik and Jay Smith and all the other evangelists and apologists that are working in Islam, because it's dangerous work. Your life can be threatened. People have been killed, so we ask that you pray for them, for their protection, for all these people that are on the front lines, because they're doing some of the most dangerous work in the kingdom. So, and we pray that God will bless them richly. And we thank you, Dr. Janosik, for being one of those.
Well, thank you for having me. And I invite those who have listened or will be listening to this recording to get in touch with me. You have my email, as Scott said, and I'd be glad to answer your questions. You also have some experts here. Scott has taken some courses in this, and he's done very well and has a good understanding of this. Jody's been grappling with these things, and he can give you some good answers too. And then Don Deal, soon to be in the future, Dr. Don Deal is working also with the early Islam and what is known as the Dhimma and the early so-called treatises that were made by the Muslims with the non-Muslims. That will be a fascinating book when it comes out, right?
I hope it will be fascinating, and I'll be happy to talk about it after I get my dissertation finished before anybody else decides to steal the topic.
There you go.
All right, we'll have you on our show. You can talk about it all you like.
And my wife said if it's not finished this year, I'm in big trouble.
Oh, wow.
Well, we better get moving on that then.
All right.
All right, that brings us to the end. Jody, do you have any last words?
Well, just keep us in your prayers. Please subscribe to our channel. Most of all, share our channel, pray for us, and pray for people that's on the front line, like Janosik and J. Smith and all the people that's writing books and telling the truth and exposing Islam's big lies. And y'all keep us in prayers, and that's it for today.
Okay.
This has been
Thank
the
you all.
Truth Seekers. Yeah, we thank Daniel Janosik for being our guest tonight and sharing his time and all his wisdom, and just, and Don Deal for coming out as well. And we are the Truth this is the Truth Seekers meeting. We are the disciples of Yahweh. And that's all for now. Thanks again, Dr. Janosik.
God
Thank you.
bless.
Good night, all, and
Night.
God bless you.
I